it's tough, especially with the older guard, allowing the new guard to flesh those ideas out and try them and go for it because they're so guarded against it.
He's the worst. That is what fans say online when this title shows up on their screen. Shane McMahon names 10 wrestlers who were frauds. It sounds like a shocking headline. It sounds like Shane sat down one day, looked into a camera, and read out a list of names. But that never happened. Shane McMahon has never released a list like that. He has never gone on camera and called any wrestler a fraud. So why does this story exist at all? And why do so many fans believe it is true? Go and search for that exact title online right now, and you will find dozens of videos using nearly identical wording, published across many different channels. Different channels, different thumbnails, but the same basic promise. A shocking list, straight from Shane McMahon himself, naming the wrestlers he supposedly considers frauds. Click on enough of these videos, watch a handful of them all the way through, and you start noticing something strange. None of them actually show Shane saying it. None of them link to an interview, a broadcast, or a podcast where he reads out 10 names. That absence is the first clue that something is off with this whole idea, and it is exactly where our investigation into the real history needs to begin. The answer is simple once you actually look at it closely. Fans took real backstage stories and slowly turned them into a myth. For years, wrestling reporters, insiders, and podcasters have talked about real tension between Shane and different wrestlers, real arguments over creative direction, real safety problems in the ring, real corporate disagreements at the highest levels of the company. Over time, all of these separate, true stories got mixed together in people's minds. Fans online started calling it a frauds list, even though Shane himself never used that specific word about anyone, on television or off it. In this video, we are going to look closely at the real conflicts, not invented ones, just the documented history that reporters and insiders have pieced together over many years. We will count down from 6 of the biggest and most talked about clashes involving Shane McMahon during his time in WWE. Some of these stories are about wrestling style, some are about performer safety, some are about family loyalty and business succession. None of them involve Shane standing in front of a camera calling somebody a fraud. But every single one of them helps explain why this online myth grew so large, and why it refuses to go away. Think of this video less like a list of accusations and more like an investigation. We are not here to prove that Shane secretly hated 10 different wrestlers. We are here to trace exactly how 6 real, separate, and completely different stories from across 2 decades slowly got mashed together into one dramatic headline. By the end, you will understand not just what actually happened in each of these stories, but also why the internet turned all of it into something far more sensational than the truth ever was. Before we start the countdown, it helps to understand who Shane McMahon actually is inside this story. He is the son of WWE chairman Vince McMahon. For most of his life, people assumed Shane would eventually take over the family business. That assumption followed him everywhere, on screen and off it. Because of that pressure, Shane spent years trying to prove he belonged, not just as an executive sitting behind a desk, but as someone willing to physically sacrifice his body in the ring like any other performer. He took dangerous bumps off cages and scaffolding. He absorbed real physical punishment on live television, again and again, seemingly to earn respect from the very locker room he was born into. That effort to prove himself sits underneath almost every story on this list. Unlike wrestlers who came up through independent promotions, small local shows, and years of training before ever reaching a major company, Shane arrived at WWE already carrying his father's name. That meant every single bump he took, every risk he accepted, was watched a little more closely by the rest of the roster. Fans and performers alike wanted to see whether the boss's son would actually put his body on the line the same way everyone else had to. Over time, Shane built a real reputation for doing exactly that, and it is a big part of why so many of the conflicts in this countdown involve Shane physically inserting himself into matches and storylines rather than staying safely behind a desk. That same instinct, choosing physical risk to earn respect, connects almost every single entry on this list, even though each story is otherwise very different from the next. Nothing shows this pattern more clearly than what happened at the 2022 Men's Royal Rumble event. This single event is really the spark behind the whole online myth, so it is worth explaining in careful detail before we get into the countdown itself. Shane McMahon was put in charge as the lead producer and match booker for that year's 30-man Royal Rumble match. This is one of the most important matches WWE puts on every single year. Getting it right takes months of careful planning because so many different wrestlers are involved, each with their own entrance time, their own spot in the match, and their own moment to shine in front of a huge audience. Reports from wrestling journalists describe a genuinely difficult planning process behind the scenes. Instead of using this valuable spot to elevate rising stars, which is usually the whole point of a Royal Rumble match, Shane faced serious criticism from people in the locker room and from management for booking the match heavily around his own performance. Shane entered at position 28, one of the very last spots in the match, and he stayed in until the final 4 competitors remained. Along the way, he had extended dominant physical exchanges with full-time main event level wrestlers like Seth Rollins, and he eliminated younger talent, including Riddle and Austin Theory, wrestlers who many fans and insiders felt should have been given more room to shine that night instead. On top of the frustration about how the match was booked, there were also real, visible production problems live on television. Miscommunication about entrance cues created noticeable confusion during the broadcast. In one specific moment that fans still talk about, Randy Orton openly refused to follow an incorrect entrance sequence that had been triggered by a production mistake, and his reaction on camera exposed just how much disarray was happening behind the scenes in real time, right in front of a national audience. The fallout from all of this reportedly forced Vince McMahon himself to step in directly. In a clear display of his authority, even over his own son, Vince canceled all of the creative plans that had been set up for Shane heading into that year's WrestleMania. Shortly after the event, Shane quietly parted ways with the company altogether. With that important context in mind, and with a clear understanding that we are tracing real history rather than repeating an invented list, let's start the countdown of the 6 documented conflicts that actually shaped Shane McMahon's complicated reputation inside professional wrestling. Number 6. Kane. Back in 2003, Kane took off his mask for the very first time on WWE television. For years, fans had only ever seen him wearing that mask. It was a huge part of what made him frightening. He was presented as a monster, an unstoppable force, something almost inhuman. Taking the mask off was supposed to be a defining moment for his entire character, a turning point that could either elevate him further or completely change how fans saw him going forward. Right after the unmasking, WWE placed Kane into a feud with Shane McMahon. On paper, this seems like an unusual choice. Shane was not a full-time, in-ring competitor. He was a company executive. He was the boss's son, working a normal schedule of corporate duties in between his television appearances. But WWE has always been comfortable putting authority figures into dramatic, physical storylines, and Shane was already known throughout the company for taking wild risks whenever he stepped into a wrestling ring. The feud between Shane and Kane produced some genuinely memorable moments for fans watching at the time. There was an ambulance match, a stipulation where the only way to win is to place your opponent inside an ambulance and shut the doors. There was also a last man standing match, where the fight continues until one competitor simply cannot get back up. Both matches were physical, chaotic, and dramatic in the way WWE storylines from that era often were. Shane threw himself fully into these matches, the same way he always did, taking hard bumps and dangerous spots to make the story feel as real and intense as possible for the television audience. But here is the problem that wrestling analysts pointed out afterward, once the emotional heat of the moment had faded. Kane had just lost his mask for the very first time. That reveal was supposed to be the moment where his character became even more dangerous, even more feared by fans and by other wrestlers inside the storyline. Instead, almost immediately, he was placed into a program against a non-wrestler, against an executive, against somebody without the same background as a trained, full-time, in-ring competitor. When a newly reintroduced monster character is booked against, or made to look human against, someone widely seen as an office figure rather than a pure athlete, it can genuinely hurt how strong that monster appears to the viewing audience. Wrestling analysts have pointed to this exact issue when discussing the Shane and Kane program from 2003. Right at the moment when Kane's character needed to look more terrifying than ever before, WWE instead placed him into a storyline that many longtime observers felt slowed down his momentum instead of boosting it further. It is also worth remembering that Kane's character eventually recovered from this stretch of booking and went on to have a long, successful career in WWE for many more years afterward. So this is not a story about permanent damage. It is a story about a specific window of time, right after a very important reveal, where the creative choices around Shane arguably slowed things down instead of speeding them up. Looking back, this episode became one of the earliest examples fans point to when they discuss how putting Shane, or any executive figure, into a dominant on-screen role can quietly work against the very wrestler that WWE is supposedly trying to build up. It set a pattern of debate that would follow Shane for the rest of his on-screen career. resurfacing again almost 20 years later during the Royal Rumble controversy we described earlier. Number 5. Bill Goldberg. Bill Goldberg first arrived in WWE back in 2003. Before that, he had been an enormous star over at WCW, a rival company that used to compete directly against WWE for television ratings during what fans now call the Monday Night War. Goldberg's run in WCW was built around short, explosive, highlight reel matches. He would often win in under a minute, sometimes in a matter of seconds. Fans loved the raw spectacle of it. It made him feel completely unstoppable, almost like a force of nature rather than a traditional wrestler. When Goldberg signed with WWE, he came in on a large, single-year contract. That detail matters, because WWE executives at the time, including people around Shane McMahon during that particular period, reportedly held real concerns about the overall deal. Goldberg was expensive relative to how the roster was typically structured. At the same time, some inside management worried that his in-ring style, built around short, explosive bursts rather than longer structured matches, would not translate smoothly into WWE's usual approach, an approach that often relies on longer, weekly storytelling and matches that gradually build across many minutes rather than ending almost immediately. There were also concerns about how well Goldberg would personally adjust to a company that produces new television content every single week, all year round, compared to the different schedule and pace he had grown used to during his time in WCW. WWE's format constantly asks performers to build long-term stories that stretch across many shows in a row. Some executives were reportedly unsure whether Goldberg was fully willing to commit to that kind of demanding, ongoing grind, especially given that his initial deal was only for a single year. None of this means Goldberg was some kind of fraud, and it is worth saying that clearly. He was a legitimate, physically dominant performer with a real background in college and professional football before he ever became a wrestling star. The issue reported at the time was really about business planning, about contract value, and about whether his particular style translated cleanly into WWE's established structure. Shane, as part of the executive team helping to make decisions about talent and money during that era, was directly involved in these internal conversations and concerns about how to best use Goldberg going forward. Because of these underlying worries, Goldberg's first WWE run only lasted about a year before he departed the company. It was a business relationship that started with an enormous amount of hype and ended with genuinely mixed feelings on both sides of the table. Years later, Goldberg would return to WWE more than once, and those later runs are remembered quite differently by fans, often much more fondly. But that first year, and the executive hesitation surrounding it, remains part of the real, documented history that gets pulled into online frauds list content today, even though nobody with actual authority inside the company ever used that specific word about him in public. It is important, before moving on, to separate two things here that often get blurred together online. On one side, there is the genuine, documented executive concern about salary, contract length, and how Goldberg's style fit into WWE's weekly format. That part is well reported. On the other side, there is the online exaggeration that turns simple business caution into something far more dramatic, as if executives, including Shane, were quietly convinced Goldberg was faking his entire dominance. Nothing in the documented reporting supports that stronger claim. What it does support is a much more ordinary story about a company weighing cost against value during a single-year contract, the kind of decision every large business has to make about expensive new talent. Number 4. Vince Russo. To understand this next conflict properly, we need to travel back to the late 1990s, during a period fans still fondly refer to as the Attitude Era. This was one of the most commercially successful periods in the entire history of WWE. Ratings were high. The product was edgy, unpredictable, and constantly pushing boundaries. But behind the scenes, away from the cameras, there was a real and significant disagreement brewing about exactly how the show should be written from week to week. Vince Russo was the head writer during this period. He believed strongly in a fast-paced style that people now often call crash TV. This meant constant chaos on screen. Championship titles could change hands multiple times in a single night. Storylines moved incredibly quickly from one twist to the next. The line between what was scripted and what felt spontaneously real was deliberately blurred at almost every opportunity. Russo wanted every single segment of the show to feel unpredictable, shocking, and fast-moving, almost like flipping through television channels and stumbling onto something wild no matter where you landed. Shane McMahon disagreed with a lot of this overall approach. Shane wanted matches and storylines that built up gradually over time. He believed strongly in traditional structure, where a feud slowly develops week after week, tension steadily builds between the characters involved, and the eventual payoff at a major pay-per-view event actually means something to fans, because they have been waiting patiently and investing emotionally in that particular story. Shane worked closely with other important creative figures at the time, including Bruce Pritchard and Jim Ross, and together this group pushed back firmly against Russo's chaotic, rapid-fire style of writing television. This disagreement was not a public screaming match, and it was not conducted in front of cameras or fans. It was a genuine difference in creative philosophy playing out at the highest levels of the company, away from public view. Two very different visions for how professional wrestling television should be written, both actively competing to win out during one of the single most important eras in the entire business. In late 1999, Russo eventually left WWE to join WCW, the rival promotion that WWE had been directly competing against for years. With Russo gone from the writing team, Shane stepped more directly and more visibly into the overall creative process. He formally joined the booking committee and helped guide the storytelling direction of the shows going forward from that point on. The years immediately following this shift, specifically 2000 and 2001, are remembered today as some of the most commercially successful years in the entire history of WWE. Shane's more structured, patient approach to storytelling, blended together with the raw energy and edge of the Attitude Era, is often credited by historians of the business as an important part of that ongoing success. This particular story is really about a genuine creative disagreement at the top of a major company, not about personal hatred between two people, and it is certainly not about anyone publicly calling anyone else a fraud on camera. It shows a young Shane McMahon fighting hard for his own vision of how the business should operate, and ultimately winning that internal argument in a way that reshaped the direction of the company for years afterward. This same period also connects to another major chapter in Shane's on-screen history. In 2001, WWE purchased the assets of the struggling WCW, its longtime rival. As part of the storyline built around that purchase, Shane was presented on screen as the new on-air owner of WCW, leading what fans now call the Invasion angle, where WCW and WWE performers were pitted against each other in a single, combined storyline. That angle is widely remembered as chaotic and difficult to book, with a large roster of WCW talent needing to be worked into an already busy WWE schedule. Shane's on-screen leadership of that entire angle placed him directly at the center of one of the most ambitious and most heavily debated creative projects in company history, adding yet another layer to his reputation as someone constantly at the middle of big, complicated creative decisions. Number 3. Triple H. This next story is really about family, just as much as it is about professional wrestling itself. Triple H, whose real name is Paul Levesque, would eventually go on to marry Shane's sister, Stephanie McMahon. Today, Triple H holds one of the single most powerful executive positions inside the entire company, overseeing much of its creative direction. But the road that led to that marriage, and eventually that powerful position, involved real, documented friction with Shane along the way. Back in the late 1990s, Triple H and Stephanie McMahon began a romantic relationship with each other. At that particular time, there was an old, mostly unwritten rule that existed throughout professional wrestling, one that kept a clear separation between company management, often casually referred to as the office, and the actual performers, often casually referred to as the boys. A top-level wrestler dating the boss's own daughter crossed that traditional line in a way that made a number of people inside the company uncomfortable at the time, and that reportedly included Shane himself. What made the situation even more difficult for Shane was the fact that the relationship was deliberately kept hidden from him for a certain period of time before it eventually became public knowledge. Finding out that something this personally significant had been concealed from him created real, lasting friction between the two men, friction that took a long time to fully settle. Shane has actually spoken about this directly in public, though only in fairly limited detail. During an interview conducted by Mick Foley on WWE Network back in May of 2016, Shane was asked quite directly about the current state of his relationship with Triple H. His answers during that interview were widely described by people who watched it as guarded and noticeably careful. Shane mostly chose to focus on the simple fact that Triple H makes his sister happy, without offering much further detail about exactly how close he personally feels toward him. On top of this deeply personal history, there is also a significant business dimension running through this entire story. For years, a great many people inside and outside the company genuinely expected Shane to eventually take over leadership of WWE, given that he is Vince McMahon's only son. But steadily throughout the 2000s, it was actually Stephanie and Triple H who rose into the most powerful and influential executive roles within the company, gradually taking on more and more operational authority as the years passed. That significant shift in overall power, combined together with the earlier personal tension stemming from the secret relationship, created a genuinely complicated dynamic between two men who today both sit near the very top of the same enormous family business. This particular story is not about Triple H being any kind of fraud, and it is also not about Shane publicly attacking him in any way, shape, or form. It is a real, well-documented story about family loyalty, about broken trust, about corporate timing, and about shifting power, all tangled tightly together within one single relationship that continues to shape the direction of WWE even today. What makes this story stand out compared to the others on this list is how long it has quietly lingered in the background. Most of the conflicts in this countdown involve a specific event or a specific year. This one stretches across decades, starting with a secret relationship in the late 1990s and continuing all the way through corporate restructuring in the 2000s, right up to a guarded television interview in 2016. Shane has never gone further than that Mick Foley interview in discussing it publicly, which means most of what fans know comes from careful reading between the lines rather than any direct, detailed statement from Shane himself. That gap between limited public comment and a genuinely long, complicated private history is exactly the kind of space where online myths tend to grow. Number 2. CM Punk. CM Punk's time inside WWE, especially during the period stretching from around 2011 through 2014, remains one of the single most talked about eras in modern professional wrestling history. Punk became widely known for speaking his mind openly, both during scripted promos on television and also during real, unscripted interviews conducted outside of the company's official platforms. His frustrations during this period were mostly aimed directly at Vince McMahon and at Triple H, particularly regarding how his on-screen character was being booked and how his personal medical situation was allegedly being handled as his run in the company wound down. But Punk's overall criticism was never just about those two specific individuals. It represented something much bigger and more structural. Punk frequently spoke about a deep divide he perceived between performers who felt like genuine outsiders, people who had slowly worked their way up through smaller, independent wrestling promotions, and the large corporate structure sitting at the very top of WWE, a structure largely controlled by members of the McMahon family across multiple generations. Shane, as a lifelong member of that same family, and someone who has personally held various executive roles at different points throughout his career, naturally became part of that same corporate structure in Punk's eyes, even without any specific, publicly documented back-and-forth argument taking place directly between the two of them. This underlying tension reflects something that wrestling fans still actively argue about even today. Some performers feel strongly that a company run by a single family across multiple generations can quietly create a culture where certain voices and certain opinions matter noticeably more than others inside the building. Punk became one of the loudest and most visible voices pushing back hard against that entire culture from within the company itself, before eventually walking away from WWE altogether for a period of several years. Shane was not the primary or main target of Punk's specific, well-documented complaints during this period. That particular distinction usually goes directly to Vince McMahon and to Triple H, based on the reporting available. But the broader corporate tension that Punk consistently described throughout his run, the general feeling of an independent, self-made performer clashing directly with a large, family-run business structure, absolutely includes the surrounding environment that Shane himself was very much a part of during those years. It stands as one more genuine piece of documented friction that adds meaningfully to the overall myth-building process happening around Shane's public name, even in the complete absence of a direct, personal conflict between the two men ever becoming public knowledge on its own. This particular entry on the countdown works a little differently from the others, and it is worth pointing that out clearly. Where the Kane, Goldberg, and Russo stories involve Shane directly, in the middle of a booking decision or a creative argument, the Punk story is really about Shane being included inside a larger group that Punk was frustrated with, rather than being singled out personally. Fans researching this topic sometimes blur that distinction, assuming Shane and Punk had some kind of direct, personal falling out. The available reporting simply does not support that stronger version of the story. What it does support is Shane's position as a visible member of the very corporate structure that Punk spent years publicly criticizing. That distinction is exactly the kind of detail that gets lost as a story travels further and further from its original source. A careful reporter writing about corporate tension between an independent performer and a family-run company becomes, a few retellings later, a much simpler claim that Shane and Punk personally clashed. Neither claim is dramatic enough on its own to justify calling anyone a fraud, but each retelling nudges the story a little closer to that exaggerated territory, one small simplification at a time. Number 1. Brock Lesnar. This is the single biggest, most physically intense, and most talked about story on this entire list, and it centers almost entirely on one specific night. SummerSlam 2016. The scheduled main event that particular evening was Brock Lesnar going up against Randy Orton. The match itself was actually scheduled from the very beginning to end by way of a technical knockout, meaning the referee is supposed to step in and stop the match once it becomes clear that one competitor simply cannot safely continue. To make that specific finish look completely real and believable to the live crowd and the television audience, Lesnar removed his protective gloves partway through the match and delivered what wrestlers commonly call hardway elbow strikes. These particular strikes are not padded, not softened in any meaningful way, and are not simply designed to look painful for the cameras. They are genuinely real strikes, specifically intended to cause a real, visible cut on the opponent's skin. Orton ended up suffering a severe cut across his forehead that ultimately required 10 individual staples to properly close, and he was also legitimately concussed as a direct result of the repeated impact during that sequence. Here is the part of the story that made that particular night explode into chaos backstage almost immediately. Vince McMahon has long been famous throughout the wrestling industry for keeping match finishes extremely secret, sometimes even withholding key details from other performers who are not directly involved in that specific match. Because of that intense secrecy, almost nobody working backstage that night actually knew ahead of time that the bloody finish had been carefully planned out in advance. Most people watching from behind the curtain, including some very experienced veteran wrestlers, genuinely believed that Lesnar had gone completely off script and had actually hurt Orton for real, without any planning involved at all. Shane McMahon was also directly involved in the on-screen, storyline side of this particular moment. As part of the official televised angle, Shane came out to the ring to check on Orton's condition and to confront Lesnar in front of the live crowd, and he ended up taking a full F5, one of Lesnar's most dangerous and devastating signature moves, live on television in front of thousands of fans. That represents a real, significant physical risk that Shane willingly accepted as part of simply doing his job that particular night, just as he had done many times before throughout his career. But stepping outside of the storyline itself, this specific incident reportedly deepened already existing concerns among WWE's broader executive team, including individuals like Shane, regarding Brock Lesnar's overall in-ring style and approach. Lesnar has long carried a reputation throughout the industry for being unusually stiff and unusually physical compared to many other performers on the roster, and incidents like this particular one raised serious, ongoing questions backstage about performer safety more broadly, about exactly how much advanced planning gets shared with the rest of the roster before a big match, and about the generally unpredictable nature of live, physical moments like the one that unfolded that night at SummerSlam. This is the specific story that sits at the very top of this countdown, because it involves the clearest, most well-documented combination of real physical injury, a real backstage physical conflict between two respected performers, and real, lasting executive concern, all stemming from a single, chaotic night. It is not about Shane McMahon calling Brock Lesnar a fraud in any way. It is about a dangerous, unpredictable night that still gets brought up regularly whenever people inside or outside the industry talk about trust, safety, and communication backstage in WWE. It also says something important about Shane's own approach that, even while these serious safety concerns were reportedly circulating among executives, Shane still chose to physically involve himself in the storyline that night, taking a live F5 from one of the most powerful performers in the entire industry. That decision fits the same pattern we saw at the very start of this video, where Shane consistently chose physical risk as a way of staying connected to the in-ring side of the business, even during moments of real executive concern about safety happening at the exact same time. So that brings us back around to the central question we asked at the very start of this video. If Shane McMahon never actually called any of these wrestlers frauds, on camera or otherwise, why do so many fans out there sincerely believe that he did? The honest answer really comes down to exactly how internet wrestling culture tends to operate today. Real documented stories, just like the 6 you have just heard across this entire countdown, get repeated over and over again across countless videos, forums, comment sections, and podcasts, often for many years in a row, Over that long stretch of time, small details naturally get simplified along the way. Important nuance quietly gets lost somewhere in the retelling. A genuinely complicated story about creative disagreement slowly turns into a much simpler headline over time. A real, documented safety concern gradually turns into something that sounds more like a dramatic personal accusation. Eventually, all of these separate, individually true stories get flattened together into one single, exaggerated idea, a mythical list of frauds that Shane supposedly named out loud somewhere, even though he genuinely never did anything of the kind. The real Shane McMahon story is not really about publicly burying wrestlers on camera or reading out some kind of insulting list for an audience. It is fundamentally about someone caught between three very different roles throughout his entire career. The son of the boss, constantly facing pointed questions about whether he genuinely earned his position within the company. A performer who repeatedly took extreme physical risks, from dangerous steel cage bumps all the way to a live F5 in front of a packed arena, seemingly to prove that he belonged inside that ring just as much as anyone else on the roster. And an executive who found himself stuck squarely in the middle of real creative disagreements, real safety debates, and real family tension, all of which helped shape one of the biggest and most influential wrestling companies anywhere in the world. Taken together, all 6 of these stories paint a picture of a man who spent decades trying to balance loyalty to his family with respect from his own peers, all while operating inside one of the most scrutinized entertainment companies on the entire planet. That balancing act rarely produces the kind of clean, simple villain story that thrives online. It produces something messier, more human, and ultimately more interesting than any invented list of frauds ever could. None of that adds up to one clean, simple, dramatic headline that fits neatly onto a thumbnail. But it does add up to a much more accurate and much more honest picture of who Shane McMahon actually is. And it helps explain why his name keeps getting pulled back into stories exactly like this one, again and again, even when the loudest, most exaggerated version of that story never actually happened in the first place. The next time a title like this one shows up on your screen promising a shocking list of names, it is worth remembering that the real story underneath it is usually far more layered, far more human, and far more interesting than the headline ever lets on. 6 real conflicts, spread across more than 20 years, involving completely different people, completely different pressures, and completely different outcomes, all quietly folded together into one exaggerated headline that Shane McMahon himself never actually spoke out loud. That is the real story here, and it is the one worth remembering the next time this particular myth resurfaces online, no matter how dramatic the next thumbnail or the next title happens to look.